Welcome, everybody, to another author interview. Today, I'm very happy to say I am joined by Fonda Lee, author of Jade City and Jade War. If you've been paying attention to the channel, you know Jade City probably got one of the most positive reviews of this year so far. And thank you so much for coming on to talk with me today.
Thanks, Dan. It's nice to be here.
So, Jade City does not read like traditional fantasy. It's very modern, I'd say, in a lot of its writings and literally. And I would just like to ask probably one of the most repeated questions you get, but I got to know, how did you come up with the idea for Jade City? Where did you pull inspirations from other authors in real world? How did you develop that idea?
Yeah, so Jade City started as the title. So I have a note in my writing notebook dating back to 2013 that's just the title, Jade City. And then underneath it, I wrote a couple of lines, and one of them was a fantasy world set in the modern era, but where combat is hand-to-hand and power rests with those who have Jade. And then underneath that, I had another line that was like, cool, I have no characters and no plot. And then it rested there for about 2 years, but the idea just stuck with me. So the world and the vision and the aesthetics of that world had come to me and taken residence in my brain and refused to leave. So as an author, that's when I know that an idea is worth pursuing, is when, you know, you have plenty of ideas. Most of them, you wake up the next morning and you're like, what was I thinking? But this one stuck around. And Jade City was a passion project of mine. I was on contract for a couple of other science fiction novels and started working on this as my first adult fantasy novel. I had no idea if it would sell. It was just a mashup of things that I loved. So I wanted to write something that was this combination of epic fantasy, gangster fiction, and martial arts set in this Asia-inspired secondary world. And it was just me taking all these things that I loved and finding ways to put them together in a way that felt very organic and built from the ground up. And part of it was wish fulfillment on my part. So I've been studying martial arts for many years, and I cannot jump over walls. I cannot do chi blasts. I do not have psychic powers. It is very frustrating. So part of me was just like, there has to be an explanation for why these characters in my favorite kung fu films have all of these aerial and super strength and psychic martial arts abilities, and I cannot achieve that. So there has to be this tangible reason for why that exists. And I envision these powers coming from some magical substance, right? I'm a fantasy writer, so it is definitely not new to have a fantasy magic substance of some sort. Often it's, you know, diamonds or crystals or what have you. But in Asian culture, the most prized substance is jade. And for thousands of years, you know, the Chinese have referred to it as the stone of heaven. It was considered this link between the divine realm and the earthly realm. So it was already kind of figuratively magical. So I just made it literally magical in my world. And there were so many narrative things that I could do with it as an author, because you know, once I had jade, I could make it this status symbol and the characters could wear it to show, you know, their amount of training and their status and their inclusion in this warrior subculture. So it just sort of unfolded from there. And I, from the beginning, knew that I wanted this story to be a family saga. One of my favorite movies of all time is The Godfather. And what I love about that film isn't that it's a gangster film, but that it's a family film. It's a family saga about succession and power. So that's what I wanted to imbue into this story, was a story where, yeah, there's fantasy elements, but it feels also very political and very interpersonal. So that was basically me being like, okay, I don't know if anyone else is going to like this, but these are all the things that I love, and I'm going to put them together.
I've seen an amazing trend of authors writing what they would like to read and then finding success because they wrote something very genuine like that. But that actually kind of naturally leads into my next question I had, which was, when you were developing like the criminal organization at the center of this, how much research were you spending, like nights looking into, you know, files on the mafia, or like, you know, how did you develop your own structure there?
Yeah, so I do a lot of research before I even start writing. I will take 2 to 3 months and just read and research. So in the case of Jade City, I made a list of all the things, real and fictional, that I plan to draw upon for inspiration. And that included doing a lot of research into the Sicilian and Italian American mafia, the Yakuza, the triads, watching a lot of gangster films, both from Hollywood and Hong Kong crime dramas and kung fu flicks and Yakuza movies and karambit knife fighting tutorials on YouTube. I read a lot of Mario Puzo. I read about Chicago during the Prohibition era, gangs of New York in the 19th century. I researched blood diamonds in Africa, jade mining in Myanmar, drug cartels in Mexico. And I just kind of just let it soak all into my brain. And also, I had to make Janloon feel like a real place. And a lot of people have asked me, is it based on Hong Kong, Singapore? Where is it? And the answer is it is all and none of all of those places, because I was scrutinizing maps and travel guides for Taipei and Tokyo and Hong Kong and Singapore, and looking at cityscapes and photographs of food, and the studying the rise of those Asian nations post World War II and the economic boom that they went through. So I just took all of that and let it settle in my brain and stir together, and then I put it all aside and start writing.
That couldn't have been the happiest time of research. There's a lot of dark material.
There is. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
They're interesting though. And so you kind of just blended all these things together, and what results, in my subjective opinion, is a very real feeling criminal organization with that strong family vibe. So in this organization though, there is this family at the center of it, and the dynamics between these characters I loved so much. They play off each other so well. It feels like they have a real history there. And do you in your head have like 3 prequels of everything they've been through together that leads up to the book how we start in Jade City? Like, how did you find such a relationship there?
Yeah, so I really built the family around the relationships that I wanted to explore. So one of the great things about writing a multi-POV saga like this is each of the characters gets rounded out in the reader's mind by being viewed by the other characters. Mm-hmm. So I started out with really some broad strokes archetypes: the responsible eldest sibling, the impulsive, emotional middle child, the black sheep of the family, the patriarch. So I had kind of like these broad strokes archetypes, and then in the writing of the story, they just keep getting layered and polished and rounded out with the interactions that they have with each other. So by the end, they feel very individual. Like I feel like I know these characters more than a lot of people in real life because I've spent so much time with them. So I start with, what role do I want them to play in the narrative? And then how do I make them real people, individualized people? And one of the things that I think about when I develop characters is that no one is the same to everyone, right? One of the things that makes characters feel flat and two-dimensional is when they're always the same. So if you've got the character who is the tough, badass hothead, if that guy is the same to if he's that way in every scene and every situation, that comes across as a very two-dimensional character. But the reality is we're not the same to the people around us. The way we interact with our coworkers is different than the way we interact with our parents, is different than the way we interact with our spouse or significant other. So what I try to do with each of my characters is figure out how they interact with the different other characters in their lives, and they may come across differently. So a character like Hilo is going to be very different with his underlings and his men than he is with his girlfriend, than he is with his sister. And that is the way that I like to think about building those characters and making them feel really well-rounded. And then the narrative is really about, like, how do you put them in pressure cooker situations where there's no good choice for them. Each of the characters in the books is forced to do things that they don't want to do, and they're torn between their personal desires and the sense of duty that they have.
Well, those are always like the highest stakes situations, right? No right answer, just choices are always the ones that'll make your readers suffer the most, which is fun as the author. When it came to writing this, were you heavily inspired by anything specific that you'd read before, or was this kind of just something you formulated in your own and just kind of sprung forward from there? Because I know some people, they say, oh, I love pulling from these 5 authors, while others just say like, no, I didn't read much fantasy, just came with that and jumped off from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it really was inspired by some pretty diverse things. Everything from epic fantasy that I did love. I grew up reading epic fantasy and loving fantasy. So a lot of my touchstones as a teen were Anne McCaffrey and Isaac Asimov, and a lot of science fiction and fantasy authors that I was inspired by, mashed with Martin Scorsese films, mashed with the wuxia genre and kung fu flicks and stuff that I discovered as a teen, Bruce Lee movies. So it was taking all of those disparate pieces and finding a way to connect them that felt really natural and felt like they were built from the ground up.
So just pulling from the smorgasbord of your childhood and just forming it.
I mean, it sounds silly when you put it that way, but yeah, that really is.
I think that's great. And you've mentioned that you wrote sci-fi before this as well. Was the transition here very natural for you? It just kind of felt like, okay, I was writing sci-fi, now I'm just making it magic, or was it a lot more effort to try and change how you were writing from one to the other?
It felt very natural, and the reason is because the magic I write and the fantasy I write tends to feel very grounded, and I approach it in a way that same way I approach technology when I'm writing science fiction. What are the rules of this world? What are the constraints? And I think of magic in almost like an economist's point of view. Like, what is this resource and how is it distributed and who has access to it? And what are the conflict points in society when it comes to dealing with this magic? Because magic in my worlds is never equitably distributed. So there's a lot of potential for just exploring social friction points and interpersonal conflict. And in the same way that I think of technology as a way of doing that in science fiction, I think of fantasy, magic as a way of doing that. And people have described the books as low magic, or kind of almost like a science fictional sort of magic, because the characters never call Jade magic. If you read through the entire trilogy, they never refer to Jade as magic. To them, it's just a natural substance that's kind of mysterious and no one entirely knows how it works. But there are things like that in our world too. So to them, it's not magic. To them, it's just a natural part of the world, and it's a way that certain people get abilities that other people don't have access to.
I found that in the book, it felt like Jade was normalized in a way that a lot of others don't normalize their magic. It felt like a day in the part of life for a lot of these people. And there's also this, not to get too heavily into spoilers here, but this artificial version of it that's being manufactured. I loved that, to see like, oh, now there's this man-made kind of knockoff version of the magic. And I thought that was so interesting. The idea of that, was that something that you just kind of late in the game put it? Where did the idea of like, oh, we're going to have an artificial version of Jade come into play?
Yeah, so one of the things that is very common in fantasy is this idea of chosen one or chosen people, right? Who can use the magic and other people who can't. And Jade City is set in a modern era. It's late 20th century. There's no cell phones yet, but it's clearly kind of analogous to a post-World War II world in our world. So to me, it just made a lot of sense that in a modern magic world, magic would be subject to technological change and globalization and modernization, just like everything else in our world is. So if there was a place with magic and a group of people who could use this, you can bet to hell that there's going to be somebody out there who has, a lab who's trying to figure out how to unlock the secrets so that more people can get access to this power that was previously contained to this one place or this group. So that blending of magic, but also modern forces and, just things that we take for granted in our own modern world felt very natural to me. And it is something that I think you don't see a lot of in a lot of other fantasy and are maybe seeing more of now.
It falls into a quote about sci-fi I really like, where someone's like, a good sci-fi author should write the car and predict the traffic jam. It's the same kind of like, okay, yes, there's this magic system. here would be this side effect. I find that interesting. And so when handling something like that, it didn't demystify Jade for me, which was something when it first came across it, I was like, could this, but there's still this layer of, it is fantasy, it is magic. And, is there other magic systems you really like out there that you kind of like, I want to tap into that kind of mentality? Or how did you establish your rules for writing magic as an author?
Gosh, I think that for me, the most important thing about the magic is that it feels like it's always been there, like it is part of the history and the culture of the place that I'm writing about. So sometimes you get this feeling in stories where this place has always been like this and always will be like this. And I wanted to create this sense of history and change. So yes, there is this magic and it's been there for a long time, but it's been through stages of evolution and it's now going through more stages of evolution. And so that I wanted to have a world in which like the rules of the magic were clear, but were also being pushed up against. And I'm not sure if there's like specific like other magic systems that I love, but I do tend to gravitate toward magic that does feel more grounded and more limited, in the sort of Brandon Sanderson kind of way, as opposed to like very unknowable and unseeable Lovecraftian kind of thing. I like to really dive into how do people interact with magic and manipulate it and turn it to their own purposes, as opposed to something that can't be understood.
And there's also a high cost to Jade as well, especially if you're not the right kind of person to wield it, which was another dynamic that really, as the kids say, hit with me. And I think that you have something there. The only thing I kept thinking was like, okay, but what about a gun?
So there are firearms, and they show up in the books. The way that I kind of dealt with that was some of the Jade powers allow you to negate firearms usage.
Right.
So in the same way, like think of the Matrix, where you've got Neo kind of like being able to predict the bullets and move out of the way. The Jade warriors can use deflection. So if you get shot at, you can raise a wall of deflection. This happens at one of the critical points in the story where a character is being shot at and he's able to raise kind of basically like a wall of force field almost, to deflect those bullets out of the way. So that reduces the usefulness of firearms. And also the characters have perception, so they can tell if another character, somebody who has malicious intent is coming up on them. So there's still firearms, but the firearms are not as advantageous against the Jade warriors as they would be against a normal person.
I should have phrased my question better. I think it was like, was there a moment where you were like, balancing? Because to me, a bullet is one of the hardest things to like weigh a magic system against, right? Because it comes down to human reaction time. And it was more just, I think you found a good way with the enhancements that Jade provides, reasonably excusing this is how a bullet can be dealt with. Right. And I thought that was a good balance there. And
also they're not invincible because you can be shot. So, the Greenbone warriors, they actually do have to worry about being shot. But one of the rules of this world is that their code of honor prevents them from harming people who don't have Jade. So just going after an enemy and shooting them full of bullets and having deflections go everywhere that veer bullets into innocent bystanders and windows and so on would be really bad for those people in the world and the society that they live in. So there's kind of, there is always that, like, how do you blend the magic into the world in a way that feels like it makes sense and it doesn't completely exit out the issue of firearms, but it does like put a different spin on it.
So I have a question that this might be a bit intense, but I just am very curious. Do you write, I'm trying to phrase this right so it doesn't come across horribly. Do you write people cynically? Do you have a view of people that this is going to go the worst path because humans are human? Or do you have more of, because I'm trying to avoid spoilers and ask this properly. There's a certain trajectory in this book that seems almost cynical.
I wouldn't say that I write cynically, but I try to write as true to human nature as I can. And I don't really write heroes and villains. If I look across all the books I've written, I would say I could rewrite any of those books from the point of view of the antagonist and make you equally sympathetic to that antagonist. So the main villain, antagonist in Jade City is this character, Aitmata, who is the leader of the opposing clan. And there are points in that story, especially near the end when she's talking about her reasons for doing things, where I want the readers to actually go, you know what? That is a good point. And I feel like I could write that story over again from her point of view, and you would sympathize with her. So I guess what I would say is it's not cynicism so much as I want to do right by the perspectives of all the characters. And everyone has strengths that can also be their weakness. And we just know that, I think, intuitively as people, that, you know, some of the things that are great about a given person when taken too far are also their weakness, right? If you're really hardworking, you could become a workaholic. I think that there is that innate struggle within every person. So I try to unlock that for every character as well. Like, what are the things about them that make them a sympathetic, relatable, and heroic character, but that are also potentially an Achilles heel that they have to deal with, they have to struggle with. So I'm just trying to write, I think, characters that feel as real as possible, that I've really thought about who they are. And, you know, I go down the whole path of, like, you know, analyzing their personalities and like, you know, doing like Myers-Briggs tests on them and stuff until I feel like I really understand their motivations.
And I got to say that also, to me, made your quote-unquote antagonist much more terrifying, because it's like they felt so human, and yet they've done such atrocity. Like, everyone's committed what an average everyday person in the real world would say is like a horrific crime within these families. And so having people where it's like, oh, that she could be Susan, my next door neighbor, but I just don't know this whole other side of her life. You know what I mean? It felt very real world, real human, which I was a fan of. And I would like to shift gears, if you don't mind, a little bit here to the success of the series as a whole, because this is one that's, it seems like, in the middle of blowing up to me, at least on the trends I've been seeing, and seeing the success of Jade City, Jade War continue to grow and grow. From someone who kind of started, you know, from first day of publication to now, how has that journey been of like seeing the good reviews, the success, the spread go?
Well, one thing that I have learned is that it can be very difficult to gain traction for a book that doesn't fit neatly into a particular subcategory. And I've mentioned Jade City is the book of my heart, and it's a mashup of these very diverse influences. But that meant that when it came out in 2017, it was hard to comp it to existing work. My publisher, the closest titles that they could find to compare Jade City to were Game of Thrones by Martin and Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, neither of which I think you would, based on your quizzical expression right now, right, you could say neither of those is a great comparison. But that's, they were trying to figure out, well, what do we compare this to? And people, I think, were asking, you know, is it epic fantasy? Is it urban fantasy? Is it crime fantasy? And they were kind of befuddled by the fact that it was a fantasy novel with an epic fantasy scope, but set in a modern time period. So it was by no means a hit out of the gates. And what happened was that it started getting noticed. It ended up on awards ballots. It won a number of awards, including the World Fantasy Award. And to be perfectly frank, to the extent that it has seen success, it has been very much driven by word of mouth. And people who took a chance on it, like you, who fell in love with the characters and the world and told their friends. And that, in the end, is absolutely what has allowed these books to gain the success that they have.
I got to tell you, you have a diehard fan base who, on every review, were saying, check out Jade City, check out Jade City, you'll like it, you'll like it. So they're still out there doing preaching. So fantasy is known for being a bit, what's the right word? Repetitive. Bit, oh, if you like this, here's the next version of this. And I, as a fan, am frustrated hearing that, because I want more out of left field entries. I wanted things to keep changing up. And we're seeing a lot more of that right now from a lot of authors in this latest generation who are really pulling out, and they're getting, it seems like they're finding success in a lot of different ways. But I think the biggest takeaway, though, is if you're a fan of a book that feels different, spread the gospel, because it's, everyone says word of mouth is the most powerful tool to them, it seems like.
Absolutely. And I'm really cheered by the rise of what I would term non-traditional fantasy. There's so much of it that is that's blowing up right now. And when I was growing up, every fantasy novel I read was medieval times, vaguely Northern European. And even in the last 5 years, the amount of work that's come out that is really blending and blurring genres and broadening the definition of what fantasy can be has grown immensely. And it's fantastic because in the end, it's really about making more people love the fantasy genre, right? The more we can broaden the boundaries of fantasy, the more people we can pull in. And that's great. So I'm, to the extent that I can be part of that, what I would say like the fantasy renaissance that I think that we're going through right now, I'm very happy to be a part of what's going on in the field right now. I'm
curious to, do you have any plans post Jade City as of right now? Is there, another trilogy brewing in the back, or is this a world you want to continue to explore in the future?
Well, I just handed in the manuscript for Jade Legacy, which will be the third and final book in the trilogy. So you're talking to somebody whose eyes are still kind of like bloodshot and bugged out from that final push to the finish line. And it'll take a while for my editor to get back with revisions and so on. But Jade Legacy, the third and final book in the trilogy, will come out in mid 2021, and then we'll see, because I have a lot of other ideas. I have another series that is separate from the Greenbone saga that I want to dive into. I have some ideas that are kind of floating around the Greenbone saga world, so I might do a bit of short fiction there. So I would say it's still TBD. So lots of other ideas. How much more stuff I do in the Greenbone saga world will kind of depend.
Okay. I wasn't trying to dig in and get the scoop, but I kind of was. But I look forward to it no matter what. And in terms of your publication before Jade City, Jade War, have you seen some resurgence there as your audience kind of flowed backwards up your bibliography as well?
It's hard to say, because I think there definitely are readers who are more hardcore fantasy readers who don't float back towards my science fiction. But then again, there are definitely those who like, I'll check out some of the backlist. So I'm not entirely sure. I'm not really sure how much backflow I'm getting. But I do think that my voice is very much the same across both science fiction and fantasy. So if you did like my fantasy fiction, odds are you will probably, if you're willing to also cross the border into science fiction land, I think you would like my science fiction as well.
Any specific recommendations you think people should check out?
Well, Zero Boxer was my debut, and that is a really dear to me as well, not only because it was my debut, but because it's another story that has a lot of martial arts and but only this time it's like fighting in space. So I've kind of pitched it as like Rocky meets Gattaca, or MMA in space.
I love that. On the TBR, that's amazing.
So there's that book, and then and my other two books are Exo and Crossfire, which are my spin on an alien colonization story.
All right, well, I have a couple fan questions, if you don't mind, I would like to get to. And one of these, the first one is, I'm sure she loves all of her characters, but which is the one she has a most special place in her heart? Yes, I'm aware I'm basically asking her to pick her favorite child. So after talking about how these are people so human to you, which is your favorite?
I am not going to answer that. And the reason is because there's still a third book to come. And if I answer who my favorite is, that might predispose people to think that character is safe or not safe. So okay. I'm going to defer that because I do have a favorite, but I want to answer that after the third book is out, because sometimes you can tell like an author's favorite character is this person, and they seem to be a little bit plot immune, or they're the ones who get more crap ladled onto them. So I will answer that, but you're gonna have to wait.
Okay, I will be hitting you up on Twitter after the book comes out and saying which one's your favorite. Much of the setting in the Greenland Saga felt extremely authentic to my experience as a second-generation Asian Canadian, especially the cities which feel cosmopolitan. How much of little touches were organically from her own experiences versus how much of it was from conscious research?
It's hard to say how much of it comes from yourself and how much comes from research, because I think every author puts themselves into their work, but every author has a limited experience. And so you're taking bits of your own experience and you're glomming on research. So, I have an experience same as the person who posted the question, as a second generation Asian American. And but that experience is very narrow. I can only speak to my own experience. So what I'm trying to do is flesh that out and find additional research consciously to make that feel more well-rounded. But one of the things that the question speaks to is this idea of diaspora fantasy communities, because we often have fantasy stories where there's people cultures that feel very homogenous or monolithic, but that's not how we experience the world. We know that there's so much migration of humankind and second generations of descendants in different parts of the world. So for me, writing a fantasy story that takes place in a relatively modern era, it made sense to me that there'd be people from KCON who have migrated to different parts of the world. And a big part of the second book, Jade War, is about this diaspora community that it consists of Kekonese people who are still trying to hold on to Jade and the traditions that they have from their home country in this other country. So that was something that I didn't see a lot of in fantasy, but that spoke a lot to me personally, and that I wanted to include in my work.
You actually hit on something there I'd love to ask you about, and that is almost the theme of industrialization versus tradition that's prevalent. And I'm always fascinated by that. That's just one of the things that if you include in a book, I'm just going to be a fan. So you still managed to pay a lot of respect, I felt, though, to more cultural tradition, more, the older generation. I feel like a lot of times when people do that, it's kind of like the screw you, old man, we're going to focus on the industrial part. It's so much cooler. We have engines. How did you kind of find that balance? And was it a conscious one, or one that that's genuinely how you viewed the world, so it just kind of came that way?
Both. And I think, in a way, if you think about science fiction and fantasy, and the sort of as two sides of a coin, you often have science fiction pushing the agenda of progress and technological change and exploring the galaxy and bursting kind of out of the old and into the new. And you've got fantasy that is more concerned with traditions and history and the legacy of peoples and cultures. And so in a way, writing a book like Jade City was finding the midpoint of that, because I was putting a fantasy story in a modern setting. So there were these tugging influences. And in the same way that I try to balance my characters so that you can feel sympathetic to both sides, I do the same as well with the cultural forces that they're being pulled against, because absolutely KCON is dealing with modernization and globalization, and it's bringing a lot of great things. But at the same time, there are these traditions and these cultural aspects they're trying to hang on to. At the same time, a lot of those old traditions and cultures are not that desirable. I mean, we have characters, my female characters have to deal with a large amount of misogyny and the patriarchy that come from those old traditions. You have really like a sense of this place being previously pretty isolationist and somewhat xenophobic, and that culture having to open up and deal with all these outsiders and foreigners. So yeah, there's great things about it and there's difficult things about it on both sides. And the way I can address that is having characters who sit in different places in their own opinions as to like where they should be and how much they should be embracing the new and the different versus clinging to the old and preserving what they have.
Gotcha. Well, I gotta kind of end it on a pretty basic question, but I'm curious your answer. If you could wield Jade, would you? With the costs and the benefits, would you wield Jade?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I wrote this whole series as basically wish fulfillment for some of the powers that I wanted to have. So yeah, I would want to go to Call Dushiran Academy and shadow some of the characters there, and for sure, I would want to learn Jade disciplines. Not gonna lie.
I see the appeal. I love the magic system, but I'm not gonna lie, it scares me. So I'd probably go with a no.
I
Well,
don't blame you.
thank you so much for coming on and answering the questions. I appreciate it so much. Do you have anything you want to plug real quick in terms of like upcoming panels or release? Well, you've already talked about the third entry is coming out middle of the year next year. Perfect time to pick it up, get through the first
Yep.
two books. Anything else you'd like to plug?
No, that's pretty much it. There's going to be some additional news. There's some other Greenbone Saga things in the works, so stay tuned. There's been some. There'll be news. There will be news in the near future.
Now I have to refresh your Twitter.
That's
Love to
I
hear
can
it.
only vague tweet about it right now because I'm not allowed to talk about it. So you'll have
Gotcha.
you will unfortunately have to refresh Twitter a little bit for it.
Perfect. Well, I'll have your Twitter up on the screen now so people can go ahead and give you a follow. Thank you so much for coming on. And like and subscribe, everybody. If you have not already, hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And check out Jade City because it's going to be like on my top 10 list of the year for sure. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.